There's a country sitting on the edge of two worlds, and right now it is making a decision that could quietly redraw the map of global power forever. Not a small country, not a weak one. A country that controls the only water passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. A country that sits at the exact crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, all at the same time. A country that is a full member of NATO, has been trying to join the European Union for 20 years, and is now knocking on the door of the bloc that was built to challenge everything NATO and the EU stand for. That country is Turkey, and what Turkey is doing right now is not just unusual, it is completely unprecedented. No NATO member has ever done this before. No country has ever tried to stand in two worlds this far apart simultaneously, and the reason Turkey is doing it, and the reason the whole world is watching, comes down to something much simpler, much older, and far more powerful than politics. It comes down to geography. Turkey does not choose its alliances the way most countries do. Turkey does not have the luxury of picking sides based purely on ideology or friendship or values. When you look at a map, a real map, not a political one, you start to understand that Turkey has almost no choice. The land it sits on forces it to be relevant to everyone. The straits it controls force every major power to care about it. The trade routes that run through its territory force the world's biggest economies to negotiate with it, whether they want to or not. This is the story of how geography built Turkey's power, how that power created a dilemma that no other country on earth faces, and how that dilemma led Ankara in September 2024 to formally apply for membership in BRICS, the bloc that Russia and China built, the bloc that openly challenges the Western-led world order, the bloc that is growing faster and becoming more powerful than almost anyone predicted 10 years ago. But here is the twist that nobody tells you when this story begins. Turkey applied. The world gasped. NATO was alarmed. Washington was furious. European capitals were stunned. And then BRICS said, no, not yet, not fully. They offered Turkey something called partner country status, a waiting room with a diplomatic name attached to it. And Turkey, proud and strategic as always, has not even fully accepted that offer. So Turkey is now suspended between two worlds, fully belonging to neither, wanted by both, and using that suspended position with a precision that is either the most brilliant foreign policy strategy of the 21st century or the most dangerous balancing act in modern geopolitics, depending entirely on who you ask. To understand how this happened and why it matters to every country on Earth, you have to go back to the map. You have to understand what Turkey actually is, geographically, before you can understand anything it does politically. Because once you see the geography clearly, every single decision Ankara makes stops looking strange and starts looking almost inevitable. Turkey is shaped like a bridge. That is not a metaphor. It is literally shaped that way on the map. The country stretches from the Balkans in the west, directly touching Greece and Bulgaria, which are both EU and NATO members, all the way east to Iran, Iraq, and the borders of the Caucasus. In the north, it sits along the entire southern coast of the Black Sea. In the south, it borders the Mediterranean and shares a long, complicated land border with Syria. It is simultaneously a European country, a Middle Eastern country, a Black Sea power, and the only European state that directly shares a border with Iran. No other country on Earth holds this combination of geographic positions at exactly the same time. And in the middle of this country, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, sits one of the most strategically important pieces of water on the entire planet, the Bosphorus Strait, 20 miles long, half a mile wide at its narrowest point. Every ship, every oil tanker, every naval vessel that needs to move between the Black Sea and the rest of the connected ocean world must pass through this narrow channel, and Turkey controls every inch of it. Under the 1936 Montreux Convention, Turkey has full legal authority to regulate who passes through those straits. In wartime, it can restrict or close them entirely to warships of nations in conflict. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Turkey invoked this exact power. It closed the Bosphorus to warships from all nations involved in the conflict. Russia's Black Sea fleet was effectively locked in. NATO warships could not enter either. Turkey, by doing nothing more dramatic than enforcing a treaty that had existed for nearly 90 years, instantly became the single most important non-combatant actor in the most significant European war since 1945. That is the scale of geographic power we are talking about. Power that does not require an army to exercise. Power that comes from the coordinates on the map. But the Bosphorus is only the beginning. There is a second dimension to Turkey's geography that has become dramatically more important in the last 3 years than at any previous point in modern history. And this dimension connects Turkey directly to BRICS, to China, and to the central question of how the world's goods are going to move in the decades to come. This is the trade corridor question. China has been building the Belt and Road Initiative for over a decade. It is the largest infrastructure investment project in human history. a vast interconnected web of roads, railways, deepwater ports, and energy pipelines designed to connect China to Europe, to Africa, to Central Asia, and to the Middle East. The logic behind it is elegant and enormous at the same time. Control the routes that goods travel, and you exercise enormous influence over the entire global economy without firing a single shot. The BRI had two primary overland routes reaching toward Europe. The northern corridor ran through Russia, crossing the vast Eurasian steppe, and entering Europe through Belarus and Poland. The southern route was largely maritime, running through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, and into the Mediterranean. Both of those routes are now severely compromised, and not by any Chinese decision, but by events entirely outside Beijing's control. The northern corridor was effectively shattered by the... And then there was Turkey, sitting between these two broken routes, offering a stable overland corridor through Anatolia that connects Central Asia and the Caucasus region directly to European markets without crossing Russia and without going near the Red Sea. Turkey suddenly became China's most reliable and strategically sound transit option. Not because China chose it out of preference or ideology, because geography and simultaneous geopolitical crises on two separate routes had eliminated the alternatives one by one. This shift was not theoretical or long-term. China's foreign policy calculations changed in real time as these crises unfolded. Beijing, which had previously been somewhat measured about Turkey's BRICS ambitions, started viewing Ankara with an entirely new level of strategic urgency, and the Turkish government understood exactly what was happening. Erdogan's administration watched the northern corridor collapse, watched the Houthi attacks paralyze Red Sea shipping, and recognized with clarity that Turkey's geographic value to China had just increased dramatically, without Turkey doing anything at all except continuing to exist on the map where it always had. This is the kind of leverage that geography gives you, passive, durable, and renewable. It appreciates when crises happen around it. But the geography does not stop with trade routes. There's a third dimension to Turkey's position that makes everything even more layered, and that is the energy relationship with Russia. Russia supplies approximately 50% of Turkey's natural gas, not a small share, not a minority stake. Half of all the gas that heats Turkish homes, powers Turkish factories, and keeps the Turkish economy running comes directly from Russia through pipelines that cross the Black Sea. T, his single statistic, explains more about why Turkey could never simply join the Western campaign to isolate Moscow than any political or ideological analysis ever could. When your largest energy supplier is the country your alliance is trying to economically strangle, you do not have the freedom to participate fully in the strangling. You have heating bills, you have industrial production, you have tens of millions of citizens who need power to live through winter. Turkey has consistently tried to convert this dependency into influence rather than resenting it as a weakness. Erdogan's government has actively promoted the concept of Turkey becoming a major natural gas hub, a sophisticated transit country that takes gas not only from Russia, but from Central Asian producers like Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, and routes it into European markets, giving Ankara both significant transit revenues and the irreplaceable strategic position of being the pipe that everyone in Europe needs to access. This natural gas hub proposal was actually raised and discussed, though not finalized, at the Kazan BRICS summit in October 2024. The fact that it was on the agenda at a BRICS meeting tells you everything about how Russia and Turkey think about their energy relationship. Not as a dependency that embarrasses Turkey, but as a shared economic architecture that both countries have a strong interest in deepening and institutionalizing. Then add the nuclear dimension on top of that. Russia is constructing the Akuyu nuclear power plant on Turkey's southern Mediterranean coast. This is not a future project. It is being built right now by Russia's state nuclear corporation, Rosatom, and it is expected to generate its first electricity in 2025. It will eventually provide roughly 10% of Turkey's total electricity needs. This deepens the Russia-Turkey energy relationship at precisely the moment when the entire Western alliance is trying to eliminate energy connections to Moscow. For Ankara, this is not a contradiction or an embarrassment. It is geography and economics making a decision that politics alone could never reverse. Now, step back from geography for a moment and look at the political history, because the story of why Turkey applied to BRICS in 2024 is not only about maps and trade routes. It is also about 20 years of accumulating frustration with a Western promise that was never kept. In 2005, Turkey officially began European Union accession negotiations. At that moment, there was real and genuine optimism on both sides. Turkey was reforming. Its economy was growing strongly. Its government was democratizing, strengthening institutions, aligning legislation with European standards. The prospect of Turkey eventually joining the EU felt credible. Then, slowly, the door began to close. European concerns mounted year after year. Democratic backsliding under the AKP became harder to ignore after the 2013 Gezi Park protests and the government's response to them. The 2016 attempted coup and the sweeping crackdown that followed, tens of thousands arrested, journalists imprisoned, judiciary purged, alarmed European governments profoundly. A 2023 European Parliament report on Turkey catalogued a long list of unresolved problems: restrictions on the press, absence of judicial independence, deterioration of women's rights, systematic suppression of Kurdish political expression, a refusal to comply with the European Court of Human Rights rulings. The accession process did not just slow down, it stopped. It became, in the words of Turkish officials, a process with no credible endpoint, a membership candidacy that exists on paper and nowhere else. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan made the connection explicit and unmistakable. He stated publicly that if Turkey's economic integration with the European Union had been completed with actual membership, Turkey would not be pursuing BRICS. The BRICS application is, in significant part, a message directed at Brussels. The message has two words: other options. And the economic logic behind those other options is not emotional or retaliatory. It is mathematical. Turkey's two largest bilateral trading partners are China and Russia, each with roughly $50 billion in annual trade. Both are core members of BRICS. These are not relationships Turkey manufactured artificially or sought out as alternatives to the West. They are the product of geography. China is the world's largest manufacturer, and Turkey is the closest major market between China and Europe. Russia is Turkey's immediate northern neighbor across the Black Sea, its largest gas supplier, and the country whose nuclear technology is building Turkey's first major power plant. When Foreign Minister Fidan addressed the Turkish parliament about BRICS, he framed it in terms of access to information and decision-making. Turkey needs to understand, he said, what is being discussed inside these platforms, how global economic trends are being shaped, what the future of trade and finance looks like from the perspective of countries that are already Turkey's biggest economic partners. To stay outside the room is to be blind to decisions that affect you directly. This is not ideological alignment with BRICS values. This is strategic access. And that distinction is crucial because it is exactly the argument Turkey uses to maintain that BRICS engagement is compatible with NATO membership. Not a contradiction of it, but an extension of Turkey's role as a country that must manage relationships on all sides simultaneously. In September 2024, Bloomberg published the report that the entire geopolitical world had been anticipating. Turkey had formally submitted its application to join BRICS. The report landed with immediate global impact. NATO officials expressed concern. Washington's response was sharp. European capitals looked at each other across the table and tried to determine whether this was Erdogan's latest negotiating maneuver or an actual strategic realignment. Then came October 2024, the 16th BRICS summit in Kazan, Russia. Erdogan flew to Kazan, to Russia, to the capital of Tatarstan, to a summit hosted by the country that NATO is engaged in proxy conflict with over Ukraine, and sat at the table with Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Narendra Modi, and the leaders of Iran, Brazil, South Africa, and a dozen other nations that had gathered for the explicit purpose of building an alternative architecture to Western economic and political dominance. The images from that summit carried their own message, independent of anything said in the meeting rooms. The summit concluded without Turkey gaining full membership. What Ankara received instead was partner country status. One of 13 nations offered this designation alongside Algeria, Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Nigeria, Thailand, Uganda, Uzbekistan, and Vietnam. Turkey looked at that list and saw Belarus, Bolivia, Cuba. Countries that Turkey, which sees itself as a regional superpower and a serious global actor, did not consider appropriate company for its diplomatic standing. The offer was read in Ankara as a polite demotion rather than an invitation. 3 separate forces blocked Turkey's full membership, and each one tells a specific story about how Turkey's geographic complexity becomes a political liability. The first blocker was India. India is one of the 3 dominant powers inside BRICS alongside China and Russia, and India had a clear and firm objection to Turkey's membership, rooted in a specific bilateral dispute. Erdogan has repeatedly, publicly, and forcefully raised the issue of Kashmir, the disputed territory between India and Pakistan, at the United Nations General Assembly. He has consistently framed Kashmir in terms that align with Pakistan's position and challenge India's sovereignty claims over the region. India considers this direct interference in its internal affairs and a violation of the principles that should govern relations between countries. When Turkey applied for BRICS membership, India's objection was not subtle or behind the scenes. Multiple diplomatic sources confirmed to Middle East Eye that India was the primary obstacle. A Brazilian diplomat summarized the situation with remarkable directness. Turkey is NATO. Several countries have concerns about how that would work. Turkey made an effort to signal goodwill toward India. Erdogan conspicuously did not raise Kashmir during the September 2024 UNGA session, an obvious diplomatic gesture designed to show New Delhi that Ankara was willing to adjust its behavior. It failed. Indian diplomats pointed out that Turkey had co-signed an Organization of Islamic Cooperation report in August 2024 that explicitly criticized India's administration of Kashmir. One UNGA session of silence was not enough to erase that. At the 17th BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in July 2025, Turkey again sought full membership. India again blocked it. The veto held. The second barrier was what analysts have started calling the NATO paradox. BRICS was conceived, built, and expanded as an alternative architecture to the Western-dominated global order. Its new development bank was designed as an alternative to the World Bank and the IMF. Its push to develop payment systems independent of SWIFT was accelerated after the United States and Europe used SWIFT exclusion as a financial weapon against Russia. The entire institutional logic of BRICS is rooted in reducing dependence on infrastructure controlled by Western powers, admitting the only exclusively Western military alliance's member, a country whose security framework is defined by its NATO membership, creates a structural contradiction that Brazil, India, and South Africa are genuinely uncomfortable with. These countries' standing in the global South depends on real non-alignment. Turkey's presence would not be neutral. It would raise questions about BRICS's identity and independence that the bloc's non-Russian, non-Chinese members are not ready to answer. The third force was the United States itself, arriving in the form of very specific threats from President Trump. In January 2025, Trump posted on Truth Social that any country aligning with what he called the anti-American policies of BRICS would face an additional 10% tariff surcharge on top of existing trade barriers, adding that there would be no exceptions. This was not abstract. It was pointed directly at exactly the kind of move Turkey was making. Simultaneously, Turkey was engaged in sensitive negotiations with Washington over military hardware. The F-35 fighter jet program, from which Turkey was expelled in 2019 after it purchased Russia's S-400 air defense system, had been a sore point in the bilateral relationship for years. There were also ongoing discussions about potential F-16 upgrades. The Trump administration appeared more open to movement on these issues than its predecessor, partly because Erdogan had invested significantly in cultivating a personal working relationship with Trump built on mutual transactionalism. Turkey could not afford to formally accept BRICS partner status or push harder for full membership at the exact moment when it was negotiating for American jets and trying not to trigger American tariffs. So Turkey went quiet. The official position became deliberate ambiguity, and the ambiguity was not accidental. This is Erdogan's core strategic model, refined over more than 2 decades of continuous power. He does not choose sides. He maximizes the value of not choosing sides for as long as the structural circumstances allow him to keep doing it. He bought the Russian S-400 system while maintaining NATO membership and survived the diplomatic storm by being too geographically important to fully expel. He mediated peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul in 2022 while simultaneously selling Bayraktar combat drones to the Ukrainian military. He blocked Sweden's NATO membership application for over a year, then granted approval in exchange for specific concessions, having extracted the maximum possible value from the delay before finally giving in. The BRICS gambit is the same logic, scaled to a larger stage. The value of applying for BRICS was never purely about actually joining BRICS. A significant portion of the value was in demonstrating to Washington and Brussels that Turkey has real, credible, economically grounded alternatives. That if the West continues to keep the EU door closed, continues blocking Turkey's defense industry ambitions, continues treating Ankara as a junior partner whose interests can be routinely ignored, then Turkey will find other rooms to sit in, rooms that are getting larger, better funded, and more consequential every year. But the strategy is not without visible costs. Turkey has, in the course of this balancing act, generated distrust on virtually every side simultaneously. NATO allies look at the S-400 purchase, the documented help Turkey provided in allowing Russia to partially evade financial sanctions through Turkish banks and trade channels, and the BRICS application itself, and they see a partner that cannot be fully trusted or fully relied upon. BRICS members look at the NATO membership, the active pursuit of American F-35 jets, and the EU customs union arrangement, and they see a country that might be a Trojan horse carrying Western intelligence interests into their most sensitive discussions. India sees a country that actively supports Pakistan on its most sensitive sovereignty dispute. The United States sees a country that deepened its economic relationship with Russia at precisely the moment Washington was trying to strangle the Russian economy. The Royal United Services Institute in London articulated this with precision. Turkey is now viewed not only by Western countries, but also by many BRICS members with distrust and suspicion. That is an extraordinarily difficult position, distrusted by both sides of the sharpest geopolitical divide on the planet at the same time, for exactly opposite reasons. And yet, Turkey continues, because the alternative to this strategy, actually choosing a side with finality, would require giving up something that Turkey cannot afford to lose. If Turkey fully and formally joined BRICS as a committed member, the political pressure within NATO would become existential. The alliance has no written rule that forces a member to leave, but a NATO country formally embedded inside a bloc built on the explicit premise of challenging NATO's geopolitical dominance would create an unsustainable contradiction. Turkey would risk losing the security guarantees of Article 5, the intelligence sharing networks, the military interoperability, and the collective defense infrastructure. For a country that borders Russia, Iran, Syria, and Iraq simultaneously, that is not a theoretical sacrifice. That is an existential exposure. If Turkey abandoned the BRICS pursuit entirely and returned to pure Western alignment, it would surrender its leverage completely. The EU door will not open on any realistic near-term timeline. Washington's relationship with Ankara has always been transactional and often cold. Without the BRICS card on the table, without the sustained Russia energy relationship, without the China investment flows, Turkey would be negotiating from weakness rather than from the position of irreplaceable geographic value that it currently holds. The middle road is uncomfortable, but it is the road that geography built for Turkey, and geography does not offer alternative routes. Because here is what all the political analysis tends to understate about Turkey's geographic position. It does not depreciate. The Bosphorus will still be there tomorrow, next year, and in 50 years. The BRI corridors will continue to require stable, reliable land transit through Anatolia for as long as the northern corridor remains disrupted by war and the Red Sea remains contested by Houthi attacks. Russia will continue to need Turkey as a trading partner and economic channel for as long as Western sanctions remain in place. China will continue to need Turkey as both a transit hub and a manufacturing gateway into Europe through the customs union. Most countries have to actively create leverage. They have to build coalitions, develop technologies, expand militaries, or strike alliances. Turkey's geographic leverage renews itself passively with every new crisis that erupts in the world around it. Every conflict that disrupts an alternative route makes Turkey more necessary. Every sanction regime that cuts off a competing economic channel makes Turkish trade corridors more valuable. The world keeps creating Turkey's leverage for it. That is the foundation of the entire BRICS story. Turkey went to Kazan in October 2024. Knowing exactly what it was worth. It renewed that calculation at Rio in July 2025. It will keep renewing it at every summit, every bilateral meeting, every negotiation with Washington over fighter jets, and with Brussels over frozen accession talks. There is also a domestic economic argument for BRICS that Turkish officials have made explicitly and that Western analysis tends to underweight. The February 2023 earthquake that devastated southeastern Turkey was one of the most destructive natural disasters in the country's modern history. Over 50,000 people died. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. The cost of reconstruction was estimated at more than $50 billion. The Turkish economy, already under severe strain from years of inflation and currency depreciation, needed external financing at a scale that Western-linked institutions were either unable or unwilling to provide, at terms Ankara found acceptable. The new development bank, BRICS' own financing institution, became a serious option under these circumstances. Access to it requires engagement with BRICS. Engagement with BRICS requires the kind of diplomatic investment Turkey has been making since 2024. The AKP's historic defeat in the March 2024 local elections, its first major loss since coming to power in 2002, sharpened this economic pressure enormously. Turkish voters, hit hard by inflation that had peaked above 80% annually, punished the ruling party in cities across the country. Erdogan's response was to accelerate external economic diplomacy, new investment deals, new manufacturing agreements, new financial partnerships, the BYD electric vehicle plant worth $1 billion, the BRICS engagement, the continued Russian energy relationship, all of it aimed at demonstrating that Turkey under AKP leadership could open economic doors that the opposition could not. BRICS itself is not standing still while Turkey navigates this. The bloc now represents more than 40% of global GDP and nearly half of all the people on Earth. The new development bank has lent $33 billion across 96 infrastructure projects in member countries. The push to build payment infrastructure independent of SWIFT has moved from a discussion topic to an active development program. If BRICS succeeds in creating a genuine alternative financial architecture, one that allows major economies to trade and invest without exposure to American financial sanctions, then the cost-benefit analysis for Turkey changes structurally. The value of BRICS membership rises. The cost of Western disapproval becomes more manageable. And if the European Union continues to offer Turkey nothing credible on accession, if Washington continues to be unreliable and transactional rather than genuinely allied, if the Global South continues to grow as the primary engine of world economic expansion, then the gravitational pull on Turkey strengthens, not dramatically or suddenly, gradually and structurally the way tectonic plates move. Imperceptibly slow until the day the ground shifts and everyone looks back and wonders how they did not see it coming. That is the geography of Turkey's move toward BRICS. Not a dramatic betrayal, not a clean ideological choice, not a sharp turn away from the West. It is a slow rotation driven by the physics of where Turkey sits in the world, what it controls, what every major power needs from it, and what it has learned after 2 decades of being promised things that never arrived. The question that analysts in Washington, Brussels, Beijing, and Moscow are all working to answer is whether this strategy can hold. The world is polarizing faster than at any point since the Cold War. The space for genuine middle ground players is shrinking. Countries that tried to sit between blocs in the 1950s and 1960s eventually found themselves forced to choose. Turkey's government is betting that geography makes it different, that the Bosphorus and the BRI corridors and the energy pipelines create a structural immunity to the pressure to choose sides that other fence-sitters cannot claim. The bet is not obviously wrong. It has worked for over 20 years, but the pressure is rising and the window for maintaining perfect ambiguity without paying a real cost is narrowing. Every summit where Turkey shows up without fully committing. Every F-35 negotiation that proceeds alongside another meeting with Putin. Every year that the EU accession stays frozen while China deepens its Turkish manufacturing footprint. All of it is adding up to a picture that gets harder for both sides to ignore. Turkey is not leaving NATO. It is making NATO pay for what it thought it was getting for free. Turkey is not joining BRICS. It is making BRICS bid for something it cannot simply take. The Bosphorus is 20 miles long and half a mile wide. It has been there for 12,000 years since the Black Sea first connected to the Mediterranean after the last ice age. Empires have risen and fallen trying to control it. The Ottoman Empire built its entire power on sitting at this crossroads. The modern Turkish Republic inherited that position and has never once stopped knowing exactly what it is worth. Geography does not lie. It does not expire. And Turkey, more than almost any other country on earth, has been reading its own map with absolute clarity. Everything it is doing right now is written on that map. Every alliance it hedges, every summit it attends while keeping one foot in the door it came from. Every silence on Kashmir followed by another signature on an OIC report. Every Russian gas pipeline accepted alongside every American jet negotiated. Every Chinese factory welcomed through customs the same week a NATO exercise runs off the coast. The map explained it all along. Turkey was just waiting for the rest of the world to look at it closely enough to finally understand what they were looking at.